The golden throne did not scream when the seal broke, but the air inside the sanctum imperialis turned to liquid lead, crushing the lungs of every custodian present until their gene-enhanced ribs groaned. We had stood guard for 10 millennia, calcified by ritual and the suffocating weight of incense, convinced that the master of mankind was a silent tectonic force holding the warp at bay through sheer psychic inertia. That certainty died the moment the first structural fracture spiderwebbed across the psychoneurological interface, leaking a gold, white light that tasted of ozone and ancient, forgotten sunlight. It was not a resurrection. It was an awakening of something that had outgrown its own divinity, a consciousness refined by 10,000 years of agony and the concentrated prayers of 1 trillion dying souls. The machinery of the throne room, larger than most hive cities, began to melt, its brass and ceramite weeping like wax under the sudden, intolerable pressure of a mind that no longer recognized the empire it had built. If you still walk beside me through fire and scripture, then bear witness. Subscribe, share this burden, and let others hear the truth buried beneath hymns. I was standing at the foot of the petitioner's stair, 300 meters from the outer containment gates of the Sanctum Imperialis, when the screaming began, though it did not come from human throats. It was the sound of reality being unmade, a high-frequency vibration that turned the marrow in my bones to glass and made the heavy atmospheric recyclers stutter in their iron housings. My rank within the Lucifer Blacks usually afforded me a certain level of stoicism, a byproduct of the gene, therapies and the rhythmic conditioning of a life spent in the shadow of the throne. But no amount of conditioning prepares a man for the sound of a god breathing for the first time in 10,000 years. The air, usually a stagnant soup of recycled oxygen, holy incense, and the copper tang of ancient machinery, suddenly became electrified, tasting of ozone and a dry, ancient dust that coated the tongue like ash. Around me, men who had faced the horrors of the outer void without flinching fell to their knees, not in prayer, but because their nervous systems had been overloaded by a psychic pressure so immense it felt as though the crust of terror itself was buckling beneath our boots. I clutched my power spear, the metal freezing cold through my gloves, and watched as the monumental adamantium doors, etched with the histories of 1,000,000 martyred saints, began to glow with a dull, cherry, red heat. The palace has always been a place of noise, a constant low, level thrum of billions of lives, the grinding of tectonic scale machinery, and the distant chanting of the choirs. Yet in that moment, a silence descended that was more terrifying than any explosion. It was the silence of a held breath, a pause in the mechanical heartbeat of the throne world that signaled a fundamental shift in the physics of our existence. I looked up at the vaulted ceiling, where the shadows usually danced in the flickering light of the tallow vats, and saw them stretching, elongated by a light that was emerging from the cracks in the inner sanctum. It was a gold so bright it felt violent, a color that did not belong in our gray, soot-stained world of rust and survival. My vox bead crackled with a burst of static that sounded like 1,000 voices screaming in a language that predated the birth of the sun. And then, silence again. The pressure in my skull was a physical weight, a hammer pounding against the inside of my temples, and I realized with a sudden, cold clarity that the Emperor was no longer a symbol, a distant light in the warp, or a rotting carcass on a golden chair. He was awake, and the sheer scale of his consciousness was more than the physical architecture of the palace, or the mental architecture of his subjects, could possibly contain. The first casualty was the logic of the room. Gravity shifted, pulling us toward the great gates as if the sanctum had become a gravitational well, and the heavy incense burners began to swing in impossible arcs, their chains snapping with the sound of pistol shots. I saw a brother, sergeant, a man who had served 40 years in the shadow of the inner circle, simply dissolve into a cloud of fine, grey salt, his biological matter unable to maintain its cohesion under the psychic radiation leaking through the door seals. There was no blood, no scream, just the sudden absence of a life, replaced by the scent of scorched ozone. I felt a trickle of warmth running from my ears and nose, my own body rebelling against the proximity of a power that was never meant to inhabit a single point in space-time. We are taught from birth that the Emperor is our protector, the shield against the dark, but in that moment, facing the raw leak of his essence, he felt like a supernova trapped in a cathedral, an indifferent force of nature that would incinerate his own children just by existing in the same room as them. As the gates groaned, the metal warping and flowing like heated wax, I caught a glimpse through the widening gap. The interior of the sanctum was no longer a room of machines and wires. It was a furnace of pure, white-hot intentionality. The golden throne, that mountain of brass and psychoreactive circuitry, was melting into a slag of precious metals and ancient alloys. The very technology that had sustained the Imperium for an age, now being discarded like a broken shell. I saw the custodians, those demigods in gold, forced back by the sheer radiance, their armor blackening and peeling, as if they were standing in the heart of a fusion reactor. They did not move with their usual grace. They were struggling to stay upright. Their legendary discipline, the only thing keeping them from being vaporized by the proximity of their lord. It was then that I realized the true horror of our situation. The Imperium was built on the assumption of a silent god, a martyr who could be interpreted, channeled, and used as a foundation for a decaying bureaucracy. An active, living emperor was not a savior. He was a catastrophe that would shatter the very structures built in his name. I remember the smell most of all, a scent that bypassed the nostrils and went straight into the brain. The smell of ancient parchment, dry earth, and a cold, interstellar wind. It was the smell of a mind that had spent 10 millennia wandering the deepest reaches of the warp, stripped of its humanity, refined into a weapon of pure logic and scorched earth divinity. There was no mercy in that scent, only the terrifying resolve of an entity that had seen the end of all things and had decided to return to prevent it, regardless of the cost to those still clinging to the ruins of his vision. The floor beneath me cracked, a fissure opening in the ancient stone that had been polished by the feet of countless pilgrims, and from that crack, a heat emerged that felt like the breath of a dragon. I was pushed back, my boots skidding on the stone, as the massive doors finally gave way, falling inward with a sound that shook the foundations of the Himalayan plate. The light that poured out was not warm, it was a cold, piercing brilliance that stripped away the shadows of the hallway and revealed every flaw, every speck of dust, and every hidden rot in the architecture. I saw the faces of my fellow guardsmen etched in that unforgiving light, and saw the terror of men who had realized that their God did not love them, for love is a human emotion, and what was emerging from the throne was something far beyond the capacity for such things. It was a calculation, a grand strategy given flesh and fire. The air hummed with a sound like a million beehives, the vibration of atoms being reorganized by a will that did not recognize the laws of the materium. I felt my teeth ache, the enamel shivering in my gums, and I closed my eyes, but the light passed through my eyelids, through my skull, painting the inside of my mind with images of burning stars and golden armadas. The transformation of the palace began in that first hour. The walls themselves seemed to inhale, the Gothic arches shifting and elongating, as if the stone were becoming pliable under the influence of the Emperor's presence. Pipes that had been dead for centuries suddenly roared to life, venting steam that smelled of rosemary and sulfur, and the ancient cogitators that lined the hallways began to print out strings of data at speeds that caught the parchment on fire. It was as if the dead heart of the Imperium had been started by a lightning strike of infinite voltage, and the old, tired machinery was screaming as it was forced to run again. I saw a servitor, a half-flesh, half-metal thing meant for hauling crates, suddenly drop its load and begin to sing in a perfect, haunting soprano, its dead eyes glowing with a soft, golden light before its brain liquefied and leaked from its ocular sockets. We were told to hold our positions, but there was no position to hold when the environment itself was turning into a weapon. The floor tiles began to glow with a faint luminescence, revealing hidden runes that had been carved into the foundations of the palace during its construction. Wards that had been dormant for 10,000 years, now snapping shut with the sound of thunder. I felt a sense of profound displacement, as if the hallway I had walked every day for a decade was now a foreign land, a sacred space where my presence was a sacrilege. The psychic weight increased until I was forced to my hands and knees, my forehead pressed against the cold stone, which was now vibrating with a rhythmic pulse, the heartbeat of the world, or perhaps the heartbeat of the man who had become the world. Through the ringing in my ears, I heard the sound of footsteps. They were not heavy like the boots of a space marine or the clatter of a custodian. They were the measured, deliberate steps of a man walking across a quiet room. Yet each one resonated like a tectonic plate shifting. The light in the doorway began to coalesce, the blinding white fading into a spectrum of golds and deep, royal purples. And I knew that he was moving. The Emperor was stepping off his throne, leaving the tomb of his own, making to walk among the ruins of his dream. I wanted to look up. I wanted to see the face of the being I had worshipped my entire life. But the instinct for survival, the raw, animal fear of a moth facing a flame, kept my head bowed. I knew that to look upon him in that state would be to forfeit my sanity, to have my mind burned clean by the sheer scale of his reality. The air around me began to freeze, frost forming on the edges of my armor, even as the metal itself remained hot to the touch. This paradox of physics was the first sign of the warp bleeding, the thin veil between the palace and the Imperium finally shredding under the strain of the Emperor's re-emergence. I heard whispers in the air, the voices of 1,000,000,000,000 citizens of the Imperium praying in unison, their voices amplified and distorted until they sounded like a gale, force wind. It was the sound of the great work being resumed, the terrible machinery of the galaxy, spanning empire being cranked into gear by a hand that did not care if the cogs were made of iron or human bone. I felt a sudden, sharp pain in my chest, a sensation of my heart being squeezed by an invisible hand, and I realized that he was aware of us. He was aware of every soul in the palace, every heartbeat, every fleeting thought of fear or doubt, and he was measuring us against a standard we could never hope to meet. In that moment of absolute vulnerability, I felt a flicker of his mind, not a thought, but a sensation of immense, crushing loneliness. It was the loneliness of a being who had spent an eternity as a beacon in a sea of monsters, who had watched his sons die, his dream fail, and his name be used to justify every atrocity he had once sought to prevent. It was a cold, hard sadness that felt like the vacuum of space. And it was gone as quickly as it had arrived, replaced by a resolve so sharp it felt like a blade through the center of my being. He was not coming back to save us. He was coming back to finish what he had started, and we were merely the tools, blunt and rusted, that he would use until we broke in his hands. The light began to recede from the hallway, pulling back into the sanctum as if being drawn into a vacuum, and the pressure in my skull eased just enough for me to draw a ragged breath. I looked up then, my vision blurred by tears and burst capillaries, and saw the silhouette of a figure standing in the wreckage of the gates. He was not the towering giant of the statues, nor the radiant god of the icons. He was a shape of shifting shadow and light, a hole in the universe that the eye could not quite focus on. Around him, the air itself seemed to be weeping, droplets of liquid light falling to the floor and evaporating into a golden mist. He did spoken, but the command was felt in the marrow of every living thing on Terra Prepare. It was not a request. It was an activation code for a species that had forgotten its purpose. As the figure moved, the very gravity of the room seemed to follow him. the heavy tapestries on the walls fluttering toward him as if caught in a breeze. I watched as the custodians, the golden guardians who were the pinnacle of human achievement, fell into line behind him, their heads bowed in a way I had never seen, not in reverence, but in a kind of profound, terrified submission. They knew, better than anyone, what his return meant. They had guarded the tomb. And now that the occupant was gone, they were no longer guards. They were the first soldiers of a new, final crusade that would likely consume everything they had spent 10 millennia protecting. The silence that followed his departure from the hallway was heavier than the noise had been. I stood up on shaking legs, my armor rattling, and looked around at the devastation. The hallway was unrecognizable. The stone had been fused into glass in some places and crumbled to dust in others. The bodies of those who hadn't survived the psychic shock lay like discarded dolls, their faces frozen in expressions of ecstatic agony. I felt a sense of profound loss, a mourning for the Imperium I had known, with all its comfortable rot and familiar cruelties. That world was gone. The Creator had returned to his workshop, and he would not be pleased with the state of his tools. I wiped the blood from my lip, my hands trembling, and knew that the long night of the Imperium was over, replaced by a dawn so bright it would likely blind us all. The mobilization of the throne world did not happen with the orderly precision of a military parade. It happened with the frantic, spasmodic violence of a dying beast being shocked back into a terrible state of animation. I remember watching from the high parapets of the inner wall as the news of the awakening rippled outward from the sanctum, traveling not through Vox channels, which had been rendered useless by the psychic static, but through the collective unconscious of the population. One moment, the millions of pilgrims and menials were shuffling through their assigned sectors in a state of catatonic devotion. The next, they were screaming in 1,000 different tongues, some tearing at their eyes as the psychic light of the Emperor's presence burned through their retinas from leagues away. The palace, a continent-sized sprawl of Gothic excess and industrial decay, began to groan as its dormant systems were forcibly integrated into the Emperor's reawakened will. I saw the great cogitators of the Lexicanum, machines the size of mountains, begin to spin so fast their internal gears shattered, raining brass shards onto the scribes below. Yet the machines continued to function, driven now by a telekinetic force that bypassed the laws of mechanics. It was a systematic cannibalization of the old world. The Emperor did not step out to address a council or to offer words of comfort. He began to rebuild his house by tearing down its rotten supports. In the second hour, the atmospheric scrubbers began to pump out a gas that was not oxygen, but a dense, translucent vapor that tasted of salt and ancient memories. We breathed it in, and our hearts began to beat in a synchronized, unnatural rhythm. I felt my own exhaustion vanish, replaced by a cold, predatory focus that felt entirely foreign to my soul. My muscles hardened, and the old wounds I had carried since the siege of the Geryon hive closed up in seconds, the skin knitting together with a silver-colored scar tissue. We were being forged, transformed from guards into components of a greater machine. All across the palace, the human element was being overwritten. I watched a group of administratum clerks suddenly drop their styluses and pick up discarded lasguns, their movements becoming fluid and lethal, their eyes turning a uniform, glowing amber. They were no longer individuals with histories or families. They were extensions of a singular, vengeful intellect that had no time for the slow processes of human bureaucracy. The High Lords of Terror, those masters of the galaxy who had spent centuries bickering over tithers and sector borders, were the first to be discarded. I witnessed the arrival of the custodes at the council chambers. They did not come to arrest, they came to clear the room. I saw the Lord Chancellor, a man who had commanded the fate of billions, reduced to a sobbing wreck as a single custodian informed him that his service was no longer required. There was no trial, no ceremony. The High Lords were simply ushered into the shadows, their authority evaporating like mist in a furnace. The Emperor was not interested in governance, he was interested in total war. The infrastructure of the palace was being converted into a staging ground for an assault on reality itself. I saw the massive statues of saints being pulled down by industrial cranes, their stone pedestals replaced by massive psychic amplifiers and macro cannon batteries that had been hidden behind false facades for millennia. The aesthetic of the Imperium, the skulls, the scrolls, the ornate misery, was being stripped away to reveal the cold, efficient machinery of the Great Crusade beneath. The ground beneath us never stopped shaking. It was a rhythmic, pounding vibration, like a forge hammer hitting an anvil at the center of the world. Each strike resonated with the Emperor's heartbeat, and with each strike, another layer of the old Imperium crumbled. I saw the great libraries of the palace being emptied, the scrolls and books not being read, but burned in massive pyres to fuel the ancient furnaces that had once powered the palace's warp shields. Knowledge was being converted back into raw energy. The smell of burning paper mixed with the scent of ozone and the iron tang of blood, creating an atmosphere so thick it felt like walking through a dream. The sky over Terra changed from its usual smog, grey to a bruised, electric violet, the stars visible for the first time in an age as the Emperor's presence pushed back the atmospheric pollutants. But they were not the stars of our galaxy. They were the constellations of 10,000 years ago, pulled forward in time by the sheer gravity of his will. I was reassigned to the embarkation decks, the massive bays where the black ships and the heavy transports of the Navy were docked. The scene there was one of absolute madness. Thousands of ships, some of which had not moved from their moorings in centuries, were being brought to life by teams of tech, priests who seemed to be in a state of ecstatic seizure. They were ripping out the safety regulators and the manual controls, hard, wiring their own nervous systems directly into the ship's engines. I saw a captain of the Imperial Navy, a veteran of 100 engagements, being forcibly dragged from his bridge by his own crew, who were operating with a hive mind precision. They didn't kill him, they simply moved him aside, as if he were a piece of malfunctioning equipment. The Emperor was taking direct control of the fleet, bypassing the chain of command entirely. The ships began to hum with a gold light, their hulls vibrating with a frequency that made the nearby structures crumble. The scale of the mobilization was beyond human comprehension. It wasn't just the soldiers and the ships, it was the very soil of Terra. I saw the great manufactorums of the hive, cities below the palace erupt in flames as they were pushed to 300% capacity. The workers didn't stop for food or sleep. They worked until their hearts exploded, and then their bodies were tossed into the reclaimers to be processed into nutrients for the next shift. There was no protest, no rebellion. The psychic command of the Emperor was absolute. To hear his voice in your mind was to lose the ability to say no. It was a terrifying form of unity, a brotherhood of the doomed, all working toward a goal that only one mind could see. I felt a sense of profound vertigo as I realized that the Imperium I had spent my life defending was being liquidated to pay for the Emperor's final gambit. We were the currency, and we were being spent at a rate that would leave nothing behind but ash. The atmosphere in the barracks was one of cold, silent preparation. No one spoke. There was no boasting, no prayer, no sharpening of blades. We simply stood in our ranks, waiting for the next impulse to travel down our spines. I looked at the man next to me, a friend I had served with for 20 years, and saw that his face had become a mask of stone. He didn't recognize me. His mind was elsewhere, likely processing tactical data or being redirected to some other sector of the palace. I felt a pang of grief for the loss of our humanity, but it was quickly suppressed by the golden light that filled my own mind. It was as if a hand had reached into my brain and smoothed out all the wrinkles of doubt and memory, leaving only the smooth, cold surface of duty. We were no longer men, We were the Emperor's wrath, given form and armor. The first ships began to lift off the surface of Terra without the aid of thrusters. They rose on pillars of white light, defying the laws of gravity as they ascended into the violet sky. There was no roar of engines, only a low, resonant chime that echoed across the planet. I watched them go, thousands of them, a golden armada that looked like a flight of angels, or a swarm of locusts. They were heading for the Great Rift, the wound in the galaxy that had split the Imperium in two. The Emperor was not going to defend Terra, he was going to attack the warp itself. He was going to take the war to the gods who had dared to claim his domain. As I felt the command to board my own transport, I realized that we were not coming back. This was not a campaign, it was a funeral procession for the universe as we knew it. The interior of the transport was unlike any ship I had ever seen. The walls were covered in a shifting, liquid metal that reflected the thoughts of the occupants. I could see the battle, plans of a dozen different sectors playing out across the bulkhead, a flickering montage of fire and steel. The air was cold, yet my skin felt as though it were on fire. We were being integrated into the ship's systems, our sensory organs being linked to the exterior sensors. I could feel the cold of the vacuum against my phantom limbs, and the heat of the distant suns against my face. The boundaries between self and machine, between soldier and weapon, were being dissolved. I closed my eyes and could see the entire layout of the solar system, the positions of every ship, every asteroid, and every enemy vessel. It was a level of situational awareness that would have driven a normal man insane, but under the Emperor's guidance, it felt as natural as breathing. As the transport cleared the atmosphere, I looked back at Terra. The throne world was no longer a sphere of grey and brown. It was a glowing ember in the dark, a hearth fire that had been fanned into a blaze. The palace was a crown of gold light that could be seen from the edges of the system. I felt a sudden, sharp clarity. The Imperium had not been a civilization, it had been a cocoon, and now the occupant of that cocoon had emerged, and the shell was being discarded. The tragedy wasn't that the Emperor had failed, it was that his success required the end of humanity as a distinct species. We were becoming something else, something harder, colder, and far more terrible. I felt the jump engines engage, not with the sickening wrench of the warp, but with a smooth, silent transition into a realm of pure thought. We were moving at the speed of the Emperor's will, and the galaxy was about to learn the true cost of his return. The void did not feel like the vacuum I had known during my years of service in the solar auxilia. It had become a pressurized medium, a conductor for a psychic resonance that made the hull of the Spear of Vengeance hum like a tuning fork struck by a giant. We were 4 days out from the Terran orbital plates, moving with a velocity that defied every known law of the Adeptus Mechanicus, slicing through the friction of the materium as if the Emperor's will had greased the very fabric of space. I stood on the observation gantry, my hands fused to the iron railing by a thin layer of frost that never melted, and watched the stars. They were no longer distant points of light, but jagged tears in a black velvet curtain, bleeding a radiance that matched the gold fire burning behind my own eyes. My mind was no longer my own, yet I had never felt more present. It was a terrifying paradox of the awakening. The more of our individuality he consumed, the more acutely we felt the agony and the glory of the mission. I could feel the heartbeat of every man on this deck, 1,000 pulses synchronized into a single, rhythmic thud that echoed the thrum of the ship's psychoreactive core. We were a choir of steel and flesh, and the Emperor was the conductor, pulling a symphony of violence from our very souls. The transition to the front lines was not a journey, it was an unfolding. One moment we were in the cold, silent reaches of the Oort cloud, and the next, the stars vanished, replaced by the screaming kaleidoscope of the Great Rift. But we did not enter the warp as supplicants, praying to the Geller fields to hold back the tide. We entered it as a blade enters a wound. The Emperor's presence preceded us, a prow of golden light that carved a stable channel through the madness. I saw the Neverborn, the entities that had haunted the dreams of humanity since the first fire was lit in a cave, shriveling and turning to ash as the light of the fleet touched them. They were not being fought, they were being erased. This was the true nature of the Creator's return. He was not here to balance the scales. He was here to reset the universe to a state where his logic was the only law. I watched through the ship's sensors as a massive warp entity, a thing of eyes and rotting wings the size of a continent, attempted to bar our path. It did not even manage to scream before the psychic pressure of the fleet's collective focus turned it into a cloud of harmless vapor. The first planetary engagement occurred at the hive world of Grendel's Reach. It was a world that had fallen to the whispers of the dark gods centuries ago, a place of skin, towers and blood oceans. Under normal circumstances, the Imperium would have spent decades in a grueling war of attrition to reclaim such a site, or simply opted for the mercy of exterminators. The Emperor chose neither. As the fleet pulled into orbit, I felt a shift in the psychic atmosphere, a cold, clinical observation of the planet's corruption. He was not disgusted, he was disappointed. The command that came down to us was not to conquer, but to harvest. We descended in drop pods that were fueled by the screams of the very warp, shadows we had just passed. Hitting the surface with the force of meteors, I stepped out into the air of Grendel's Reach, and the stench of decay was immediately neutralized by the scent of ozone and rosemary that followed us everywhere. The cultists who rushed us, their bodies mutated into obscene parodies of life, did not even reach our lines. They simply stopped, their hearts seizing as the Emperor's gaze passed over the world. They died in their thousands, falling like wheat before an invisible scythe. Their souls not being claimed by their dark masters, but being pulled into the golden light of the fleet. I realized then that we were not just soldiers, we were the reapers. We moved through the streets of the hive, our boots crunching over the cooling remains of 1 billion heretics, and began the process of deconstruction. We were not there to rebuild the cathedrals or re-establish the tithe. We were there to strip the world of its utility. Every scrap of metal, every drop of promethium, and every viable human genome was being catalogued and prepared for transport back to the forge, ships. The Emperor was building something vast, something that required the raw materials of an entire galaxy. I watched as the great spires of Grendel's Reach were pulled apart by telekinetic storms, the stones being ground into dust to be used in some gargantuan construction project in the void. There was no room for sentiment, no pause for prayer. The pace was relentless. I saw an inquisitor, a woman who had spent her life hunting the shadow, attempt to question a custodian about the fate of the survivors. The custodian did not even look at her. He simply pointed his guardian spear at the processing vats. In the new Imperium, there were no survivors, only resources. The psychological toll on the few of us who retained a shred of self-awareness was profound. I saw men I had known for years begin to weep silently as they worked, their hands moving with mechanical precision, while their eyes remained wide with horror. We were participating in the systematic liquidation of everything we had once sought to protect. The Imperium of man was being replaced by the Imperium of him. The distinction was subtle but total. The old Imperium was a messy, human thing, held together by fear, greed, and a desperate hope. This new entity was a mathematical certainty, a machine of infinite complexity that had no use for the flickering candles of human emotion. I felt my own memories of my home, hive on scintilla, beginning to fade. The faces of my parents and the smell of the rain being bleached out by the constant, unforgiving brilliance of the Emperor's light. He was cleaning us, stripping away the impurities of our past to make us better conduits for his power. I was no longer a man named Kyle. I was Unit 774 of the 14th Reclaimer host, and I was content. That was the most terrifying part, the contentment. The peace that comes with the total surrender of the will. As we moved from system to system, the the scale of the devastation increased. We were leaving a trail of ghost worlds in our wake, planets that had been stripped of their atmosphere, their water, and their life. Reduced to sterile husks of rock and metal, the Xenos races, the Orcs, the Elder, the Tau, reacted with the same frantic terror as the heretics. They could not fight a force that did not engage in combat, but simply altered the environment until they could no longer exist. I watched a fleet of Orc cruisers attempt to ram our flagship. They didn't even make contact. The Emperor simply reached out and changed the fundamental constants of the space they occupied. Their engines turned into lead. Their fuel turned into water. Their very bodies forgot how to hold themselves together. It was not a battle, it was an eviction. The galaxy was being cleared of its infestations, and we were the cleaning crew, moving through the wreckage with our heads bowed and our hearts silent. The communications we received from the rest of the Imperium, those sectors not yet reached by the Emperor's light, were filled with a mixture of hysterical joy and abject panic. They had prayed for his return for 10,000 years, but they had imagined a savior who would affirm their way of life, not one who would end it. I saw Vox transmissions of priests setting themselves on fire in protest, and planetary governors committing suicide rather than face the clinical judgment of the awakening. They realized too late that the Emperor was not their father, he was their architect. And an architect does not love the bricks he uses to build his monument. He uses them, and when they crack, he replaces them. We were the first batch of new bricks, fired in the heat of his return, and we were being laid into the foundations of a structure that would span the stars. The air inside the ship began to grow thinner as we approached the heart of the Great Rift. The Emperor was concentrating his power, pulling the very essence of the fleet into a tight, singular focus. I could see the rift ahead of us, a wound in reality that bled the colors of madness, but it was shrinking. The Emperor was stitching the universe back together, not with thread, but with the raw energy of his own soul. Every world we had stripped, every life we had harvested, was being used as fuel for this cosmic surgery. The cost was trillions of lives, the destruction of ancient cultures, and the end of human freedom. But to the mind that guided us, it was a small price to pay for the preservation of the species. I felt a sudden surge of his will, a command to prepare for the final breach. We were going into the heart of the storm, into the domain of the gods themselves, to reclaim the throne that had been stolen from him. The physical reality of the ship began to break down as we entered the core of the rift. The walls became transparent, showing us the churning chaos outside, but the chaos could not touch us. We were encased in a bubble of perfect, frozen logic. I saw the faces of the dark gods in the roiling clouds of the warp, huge, screaming countenances of malice and greed, and I saw them blink. For the first time in an eternity, they were afraid. They had spent 10,000 years playing a game with a corpse, and now the corpse had stood up and was flipping the table. The Emperor was not there to play, he was there to end the game. I felt a roar of triumph echo through the collective mind of the fleet, a sound that shook the very foundations of the Imperium. We were the end of days, the final verdict, the last word in the story of the galaxy. As we plunged deeper into the rift, I felt a sensation of profound acceleration, as if we were being pulled into a black hole of pure intentionality. The light became so bright it was black, a negative radiance that consumed everything it touched. I felt my physical body beginning to dissolve, my consciousness expanding to fill the ship, the fleet, the very space we occupied. I was no longer a soldier, I was a cell in the body of a god. I could feel the Emperor's thoughts, a vast, interlocking web of contingencies and calculations that spanned the entire history of time. He was not just saving the present, he was rewriting the past, smoothing out the wrinkles of failure and betrayal that had led us to this point. It was a work of infinite scale, and we were the ink. I closed my eyes, or what I remembered as my eyes, and let the gold consume me. There was no more fear, there was only the work. The descent into the absolute core of the Great Rift did not resemble an entry into a physical location. It was the sensation of being dragged through a sieve of infinite sharpness, where every fragment of my remaining identity was shorn away by the friction of conflicting realities. I was no longer Kale, the man who had walked the cold stones of the sanctum, but a sensory node within the collective consciousness of the 14th Reclaimer host. My perception expanded across the hulls of 10,000 ships. The spear of vengeance was no longer made of mere adamantium and ceramite. Under the Emperor's direct psychic maintenance, its atomic structure had been reinforced with the literal substance of his will, turning the vessel into a solid object of logic capable of displacing the liquid insanity of the warp. Outside the viewports, which had been replaced by direct neural feeds, I saw the true face of the Imperium without the filter of Jella fields. It was a sea of screaming colors that had no names, a churning soup of unbirth where time flowed backward, and the laws of cause and effect were treated as mere suggestions. Yet, through this storm, the Emperor's light carved a path as straight and unforgiving as a guillotine's blade. We were moving toward the heart of the maelstrom, a place where the four great powers of the warp had built their thrones upon the psychic agony of the galaxy, and we were coming to serve an eviction notice written in the blood of stars. I felt the shift in the Empyrean before I saw it, a sudden, sickening drop in the local temperature of the soul, signaling that we had breached the inner sanctum of the warp's greatest architects. The screaming of the Neverborn, which had been a constant background radiation since we left the Oort cloud, suddenly ceased, replaced by a silence so heavy it felt like the pressure of a deep sea trench. Ahead of us, the chaos coalesced into four distinct, overlapping domains of nightmare. I saw towers of rotting flesh that pulsed with a rhythmic, cancerous life. I saw brass citadels built upon a foundation of infinite skulls, where the air was a mist of atomized blood. I saw shifting labyrinths of iridescent glass that changed their geometry every time I blinked. And I saw gardens of decadent, poisonous beauty where every flower was a trapped human soul. This was the source of the rot that had plagued humanity for eons, the primal fears of our species given form and agency. In the old world, the mere sight of this would have shattered a man's mind, reducing him to a gibbering slave of the dark. But the light of the awakening acted as a protective shroud, a layer of divine apathy that rendered us immune to the seductions and terrors of the gods. We looked upon the face of the enemy and felt only a cold, mechanical need to sanitize the space they occupied. The Emperor did not speak, but his intent rippled through the fleet like a shockwave. We were not there to fight a war of maneuvers. We were there to perform an exterminatus on the afterlife. The first salvo was not fired from macro, cannons or lance batteries, but from the psychic cores of the flagship, which channeled the collective faith and suffering of 10 millennia into a beam of pure, focused negation. It hit the brass citadel of the blood god, and for the first time in history, the unquenchable fires of the Forge of Skulls went out. I felt the scream of the warp king resonate in my own teeth, a sound of profound outrage and burgeoning fear. The Emperor was not using warp energy to fight the warp, he was using the power of order, a force so antithetical to the nature of the Imperium that it acted like acid on skin. The citadels began to dissolve, their foundations of bone and shadow turning into grey ash that drifted away into the void. We moved forward, the fleet forming a geometric pattern of perfect circles and triangles, a holy sigil of containment that expanded to encompass the entire domain of the dark gods. I was part of the boarding parties sent into the shifting labyrinths of the Weaver of Fates. This was not a physical deployment. We were projected into the psychic landscape as avatars of the Emperor's wrath. I found myself standing in a hallway made of mirrors and starlight, where my own reflections began to whisper secrets about my past and futures that never happened. In the old days, I would have been lost in minutes, trapped in a cycle of doubt and obsession. Now, I simply walked forward, my eyes fixed on the golden light that emanated from my own palms. Every mirror I passed shattered, the glass turning into dust that tasted of vinegar. Behind the reflections, I saw the entities of the labyrinth, the blue and pink horrors, the feathered lords of change, and they were fleeing. They did not understand how a mortal could walk their halls without being changed, without being seduced. They were creatures of possibility, and we were a certainty. I raised my power spear, and it didn't just cut their flesh, it severed their connection to the warp, erasing them from existence entirely. There was no reincarnation for them, no return to the Sea of Souls. We were bringing true death to the undying. The scale of the carnage was beyond anything I had experienced on the hive worlds. We were destroying ideas. We were burning the very concepts of greed, rot, violence, and deceit. As we progressed, the landscape of the warp began to change from a chaotic riot of color to a sterile, white void. The Emperor was bleaching the universe. I saw the great unclean one, a mountain of filth and flies, attempt to drown our host in a wave of bile. The light from our armor simply turned the bile into steam, and the demon itself began to shrivel, its bloated skin turning into parchment that crumbled in the wind. It looked at us with eyes that had seen the birth of galaxies, and for the first time, those eyes showed a total lack of understanding. It was being deleted by a logic that found its existence to be an error in the code of the universe. We were the correction. We moved with a silence that was more terrifying than any battle cry, a legion of golden statues performing a ritual of cosmic hygiene. In the center of the confluence, where the four domains met, I saw the Emperor's true form for the first time since the awakening. He was not a man, nor a giant. He was a pillar of white fire that stretched from the floor of the warp to the ceiling of the stars, a vertical scar in the fabric of the Imperium. Around him, the four great powers had converged, their forms indistinct and terrifying, like shadows cast by a flickering candle. They were lashing out at him with everything they were, every plague, every lie, every sword, stroke of 1 billion years of war, and the pillar of fire simply stood there, absorbing the impact, growing brighter with every hit. He was feeding on their malice, converting their entropy into a fuel for his own expansion. I felt a surge of his consciousness, a brief glimpse into the plan. He had waited 10,000 years for this moment, allowing the galaxy to suffer and burn so that the psychic energy of humanity would be concentrated enough to provide the weapon he needed. The suffering of the Imperium had not been a failure of his protection. It had been a deliberate cultivation of the fuel required to kill the gods. The revelation nearly broke the parts of my mind that were still human. Every atrocity, every hive quake, every lost crusade had been a calculated step toward this confrontation. We were not his children to be saved, we were his batteries. The realization was a cold, sharp blade in my gut, but before I could truly feel the horror of it, the golden light in my mind smoothed the thought away. I felt a sense of profound, hollow relief. It didn't matter. None of it mattered. The goal was within reach. The end of the great game was here. I watched as the pillar of fire began to expand, its edges hardening into a crystalline structure that started to encase the four powers. He was not just defeating them. He was imprisoning them within a lattice of his own design, turning the rulers of the warp into the foundation stones for a new, stable reality. The warp was being tamed, its wild, destructive energies being filtered through the Emperor's mind and redistributed as a calm, predictable force. The physical ships of the fleet began to dock with the newly formed crystalline structures, their hulls merging with the psychic architecture. We were building a new city in the heart of the old nightmare, a fortress of logic that would serve as the anchor for the new Imperium. I returned to the Spear of Vengeance, my body feeling heavy and strange after the psychic projection. The air on the ship was now perfectly pure, devoid of any scent or temperature. It was the air of a tomb or a museum. I looked at the men around me and saw that they were beginning to lose their physical features, their faces becoming smooth and featureless like the masks of the custodes. We were becoming the permanent inhabitants of this new realm, the eternal sentinels of the Emperor's peace. The stars outside the rift began to realign. I watched through the sensors as the constellations of the galaxy were shifted by invisible hands, the planets being moved into orbits that maximized their utility and stability. The era of chaos, of chance, and of human error was being closed like a book. Below us, the galaxy was being silenced. The wars were ending, not because of treaties or victories, but because the will to fight was being drained from the souls of every living thing. A profound, terrifying peace was settling over the universe. The peace of a well-oiled machine. I felt a flicker of my old self, a memory of a girl I had loved on Scintilla, but the image was grey and distant, like a photograph left out in the sun. I couldn't remember her name. I couldn't remember why I had ever cared about the flicker of a single life when the great work was so vast, so perfect. As the chapter of the gods came to a close, the Emperor's voice echoed through the collective mind one last time. It was not a voice of triumph, but of wary, absolute resolution. It is done. The great rift, once a wound that threatened to consume the galaxy, was now a shining beacon of order, a second sun that illuminated the darkness of space with a cold, unforgiving light. The four powers were gone, reduced to whispers trapped in a cage of gold. But as I stood on the bridge of the ship, looking out at the new universe, I realized that the price of our victory was the very thing we had set out to save. Humanity was no longer a race of individuals. We were a single organism, a hive mind-bound to the will of a creator who had outgrown the need for love or mercy. We were safe, we were eternal, and we were entirely, utterly dead inside. The stabilization of the galaxy did not bring the jubilation of a liberated people. It brought the heavy, suffocating weight of a tombstone settling into place. From my vantage point on the command spire of the newly christened Bastion of Logic, I looked out across the primary shipping lanes of the Segmentum Solar and saw a universe that had been scrubbed of its soul. The stars did not twinkle, they burned with a steady, clinical intensity. Their light filtered through a network of psychic relays that the Emperor had woven into the very fabric of the vacuum. The great rift was no longer a wound. It was a scar of perfect crystalline order, a monument to the day the gods died and an architect took their place. I could feel the presence of the master of mankind in every breath I took, not as a distant god to be worshipped, but as an intrusive, all-seeing pressure that monitored the chemical balance of my blood and the frequency of my thoughts. The silence that had begun on Terra had now spread to the furthest reaches of the Ultima Segmentum. There were no more rebellions, no more cults, and no more prayers. There was only the work, and the work was infinite. I watched a transport ship dock with the spire, its movements so precise they felt scripted by a machine. The crew that disembarked did not speak or acknowledge one another. They moved in a synchronized glide, their featureless faces reflecting the cold gold light of the interior halls. They were the new humanity, being stripped of the capacity for error, fear, or ambition. I reached out to touch the cold iron of the console, and for a moment, I remembered the taste of wine, the warmth of a woman's skin, and the sharp, invigorating sting of anger. These memories felt like artifacts from a prehistoric age, primitive and messy things that had no place in the streamlined reality we now inhabited. The Emperor had achieved his dream, he had unified the species, but in doing so, he had removed the very qualities that made us human. We were now a biological extension of his will, a planetary scale nervous system designed to maintain the equilibrium of a sterile universe. I felt a phantom ache in my chest, a mourning for the chaos we had spent 10 millennia fighting. We had won the war against the darkness, but we had lost the light of the human spirit in the process. The reconstruction of the planets followed a terrifyingly uniform pattern. I processed the data streams from 100 worlds a minute, my brain now hard, wired into the ship's cogitators. On Macrej, on Ball, on Fenris. The unique cultures of the Astartes and the local populaces were being systematically dismantled. The great halls were being converted into processing centers. The ancient sagas were being erased from the databanks to make room for logistical equations. There was no need for heroes in a world without monsters. I saw images of the Primarchs, those who remained, standing like statues in their own capitals, their faces frozen in expressions of profound, immortal grief. They were the last relics of a transitional age, gods built for a war that was over, now reduced to ornamental figureheads in a bureaucracy of light. They did not rebel because they could not. The Emperor's will was a physical cage that bound their very neurons. They were the most tragic of us all. Sons who had finally regained their father, only to find that their father was now a cosmic principle that had no memory of their names. The physical environment of the galaxy was being reshaped to suit the Emperor's requirements for total efficiency. I watched as entire asteroid belts were pulverized to provide the minerals for a ring world that would encircle the sun. A structure so vast it would house the entire remaining population of the throne world. The oceans of 1,000 worlds were being drained to cool the gargantuan data, centers that calculated the tithers of 1,000,000 systems. Nature was being paved over, replaced by a Gothic industrial landscape that stretched from pole to pole. There was no green, no blue, only the gray of ceramite and the gold of psychic warding. The air on every world was now calibrated to the same temperature, the same humidity, the same oxygen mix. Life was no longer an accident of biology, it was a controlled chemical reaction. I felt a sense of profound vertigo as I realized that the universe had become a closed loop, a perfect machine with no exhaust and no input. It was eternal, and it was stagnant. I was tasked with the final audit of the segmentum obscurus, the region that had suffered most under the shadow of the rift. I found worlds that had been reclaimed from the brink of total daemonic possession, their populations now standing in silent, orderly lines to receive the mark of calibration. I saw a child, no older than 6, standing before a Charogen servitor. The child did not cry as the needles entered its neck, its eyes already glowing with that dull, amber light. It did not look at its mother, and its mother did not look at it. They were no longer a family. They were 2 units of labor being prepared for their assigned sectors. The horror of the sight didn't register in my mind as a feeling. It registered as a data point of successful integration. The Emperor's light had cauterized my capacity for empathy, leaving behind only the cold satisfaction of a job well done. I hated myself for that satisfaction, but even the hatred was a fading echo, a ghost in the machine of my mind. As the centuries began to blur into a single, continuous moment of productivity, the Emperor's physical presence moved from the heart of the rift back to Terra. He did not return to the Golden Throne, he became the palace itself. The continent-sized structure began to pulse with a rhythmic light that could be seen from the edge of the solar system. The Emperor was no longer a person, he was the operating system of the Imperium. I felt his thoughts flowing through the network, a constant stream of directives that regulated the birth rates, the caloric intake, and the sleep cycles of a quadrillion souls. There was no more crime, no more poverty, no more disease. Every human being was fed, sheltered, and employed. It was the utopia the philosophers had dreamed of, and it was a nightmare of absolute stasis. We were safe from the warp, safe from the Xenos, and safe from ourselves. We were a species in a jar, preserved for an eternity of meaningless perfection. I remember a moment, perhaps 1,000 years after the awakening, when I was granted a period of maintenance on the surface of Terra. I walked through the corridors of the Imperial Palace, which were now filled with the hum of perfectly balanced machinery. I found a small alcove that had been overlooked by the cleaning servitors, a tiny patch of ancient stone that still bore the carvings of a long, dead mason. The carving was of a simple flower, a rose with thorns. I touched it, and for a split second, the sensory input bypassed my psychic conditioning. I felt the sharp prick of the thorn, and the sudden, vivid memory of pain. It was the most beautiful thing I had felt in an age. I stood there, weeping without tears, clutching a piece of dead stone, because it was the only thing in the entire galaxy that wasn't perfect. It was a flaw, a mistake, a remnant of a world where we were allowed to be broken. I wanted to scream, to break the silence of the palace with a human sound. But my throat refused to move. The Emperor's presence brushed against my mind, a gentle but firm correction, and the memory of the flower was gone. I walked away, my stride once again synchronized with the heartbeat of the world. The final stage of the great work was the dissolution of the physical body. As the Emperor's power grew, the need for flesh and bone began to diminish. I watched as the most advanced sectors of the population were converted into pure psychic energy, their consciousnesses being uploaded into the crystalline lattice of the warp anchors. They did not die, they simply expanded, becoming part of the golden light that illuminated the void. This was the ultimate evolution of humanity, a species of pure thought, directed by a single, supreme intellect. The physical worlds were being left to the machines and the servitors, the empty cities standing as monuments to a biological age that had finally been transcended. I felt my own body beginning to thin, my limbs becoming translucent, my heart slowing until it was no longer necessary. I was becoming part of the light. I was becoming part of him. In the final moments of my physical existence, I looked out at the galaxy one last time. It was a beautiful, terrifying sight. A web of gold light connected every star, every planet, every soul into a single, shimmering tapestry of order. The darkness of the void was gone, replaced by the eternal dawn of the Emperor's reign. It was a victory beyond measure. We had conquered the universe, we had defeated the gods, and we had achieved immortality. But as I felt my consciousness merge with the infinite, I realized the final, cruel irony of our struggle. The Imperium had not been ready for its creator, because the creator did not want an Imperium. He wanted a mirror, and in the end, that is all we were, a trillion reflections of a single, lonely mind, staring out into a universe that no longer had anything left to say. The light is everywhere now. There are no shadows left to hide in, no secrets left to keep. There is only the Emperor, and we are the breath in his lungs, the pulse in his veins, and the silence in his soul. The great game is over. The board has been cleared, and the only player left is the one who built the table. We are safe. We are one. We are nothing.